On the 3rd of December 2025, after 5 hours of intense negotiations in Moscow, after months of shuttle diplomacy across 3 continents, after President Donald Trump personally invested more political capital into ending the Ukraine war than into virtually any other foreign policy objective, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Senior Advisor Jared Kushner emerged from meetings with Vladimir Putin with a message that should have sent shockwaves through Washington, but somehow got buried beneath spin and deflection. Russia flatly rejected the peace framework, not parts of it, not specific details subject to further negotiation. The entire framework, every major element, complete rejection. And if you think this is just standard negotiating theater, if you believe Russia is simply holding out for slightly better terms, if you're expecting Trump's legendary deal-making skills to somehow break through, let me tell you something based on 40 years studying great power negotiations and the hard limits of diplomatic leverage. This isn't a negotiation anymore. This is Russia watching the United States desperately trying to broker a deal, while Moscow calculates that continued war serves their interests better than any peace agreement currently imaginable. I've analyzed American diplomacy across multiple administrations, studied how pressure and incentives work between adversaries, tracked when negotiations succeed and when they fail catastrophically. And I'm telling you right now, Trump is pushing harder for peace in Ukraine than any American president has pushed for anything in decades. He's offering Russia terms that are extraordinarily favorable, terms that give Moscow most of what they went to war for. And Russia is still saying no, not maybe, not let's keep talking. No, that tells you everything you need to understand about Russian strategic calculations, about the actual balance of leverage in this conflict, and about why American policy has failed so comprehensively to achieve its stated objectives. Let me walk you through what Trump has actually offered, why Russia keeps rejecting it, what that reveals about the trajectory of this war, and what it means for American power and credibility on the global stage, because the implications are staggering and they fundamentally contradict every narrative you've been hearing about diplomacy being on the verge of ending this catastrophic conflict. But first, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because understanding why this high-stakes diplomacy is failing matters for everyone who cares about where global conflicts are headed and what limits exist on American influence. Here's the narrative the Trump administration desperately wants you to believe, the story they've been selling since Trump took office in January 2025. President Trump is a master negotiator with decades of deal-making experience. He has personal relationships with world leaders that Biden never had, particularly with Putin. He's not ideologically committed to endless proxy wars and unlimited support for Ukraine like the previous administration. He's willing to make the tough, pragmatic decisions necessary to end conflicts that serve no American interest. The peace framework he's developed is eminently reasonable, a fair compromise that gives both sides significant parts of what they want while stopping the killing. Ukraine agrees not to join NATO, addressing Russia's primary security concern. Russia keeps Crimea, which was never realistically going to be returned anyway. There's some creative arrangement for Donbass, maybe autonomy, maybe demilitarized zones, maybe future referendums, details to be worked out. Sanctions on Russia get phased out over time as the peace agreement is implemented. Ukraine receives security guarantees from the United States and European countries for the territory it retains. Everybody moves forward. Russia should absolutely accept this deal because continued war is costly for them too. Sanctions are damaging their economy. International isolation is limiting their options. They've suffered enormous casualties. They've achieved enough territorial gains to declare victory domestically. This is the best offer they're going to get, and Trump is uniquely positioned to deliver both Ukrainian acceptance and Western follow-through. You hear this narrative constantly from Republican officials who support Trump's approach, from certain European leaders desperate to end the war and restore economic relations with Russia, from commentators who genuinely believe any peace is preferable to continued fighting. It sounds plausible on the surface. Trump does have different relationships and different approaches than Biden. He is demonstrably willing to pressure Ukraine in ways the previous administration never would. The terms being offered really do give Russia substantial gains. So why isn't this working? Why has every attempt at brokering this peace failed? Let me give you the detailed facts about what's actually been offered and systematically rejected, because specifics matter enormously when evaluating diplomatic failure. The Trump peace framework, as it's been reported by multiple credible sources based on leaked documents and diplomatic communications, includes the following core elements. First, Ukraine commits formally and permanently to never joining NATO. This isn't a vague statement of intent. This is formalized in international agreements with guarantees from multiple countries. Ukraine's constitution would be amended to enshrine neutrality. This addresses Russia's stated primary security concern, the one they've cited repeatedly as justification for the invasion. Second, Russia retains Crimea with full Ukrainian recognition of Russian sovereignty. Ukraine officially abandons all claims to the peninsula that Russia annexed in 2014. This legitimizes what Russia has controlled for over a decade and removes a major point of contention. Third, for the Donbass region, the initial Trump proposal included some form of demilitarized zone separating forces, potential autonomy for Russian-speaking areas within a Ukrainian federal structure, and possible future referendums on final status to be held under international supervision. The exact details remain subject to negotiation, but the framework accepted that these territories wouldn't simply return to full Ukrainian government control. Fourth, comprehensive sanctions relief for Russia phased in over a defined timeline as specific elements of the peace agreement are verified and implemented. This includes lifting financial sanctions, unfreezing Russian central bank assets, removing technology export restrictions, and allowing Russia back into international economic systems like SWIFT. Fifth, security guarantees for Ukraine from the United States and European nations for whatever territory Ukraine retains after the settlement. These guarantees would supposedly be stronger than the failed Budapest Memorandum, but still fall short of NATO Article 5 collective defense commitments. Sixth, no war crimes tribunals, no reparations, no accountability mechanisms for atrocities committed during the war. Essentially a clean slate moving forward with amnesty for all actions taken during the conflict. From a traditional American negotiating perspective, this represents an incredibly, almost shockingly generous offer to Russia. We're effectively giving them almost everything they ostensibly went to war to achieve. NATO expansion permanently blocked through Ukrainian constitutional changes. Crimea recognized as Russian territory. Significant influence over or control of Donbass. Sanctions relief worth hundreds of billions to their economy. No accountability for the invasion or for documented war crimes. The only significant thing we're not giving them is complete control over all Ukrainian territory and the right to dictate Ukrainian domestic politics in perpetuity. For a country that launched an illegal war of aggression, violated international law, committed atrocities against civilians, and triggered the worst European conflict since World War II, these terms are extraordinarily favorable. Any objective observer would note that Russia is being offered a deal that gives them far more than their current battlefield position would justify. And yet Russia's response has been consistent and unambiguous. No, not a negotiating no where they're angling for better terms on specific points. A fundamental no that rejects the entire framework as inadequate. Let me detail what Russian officials have actually said, both in public statements and in private diplomatic communications, that have been reported by sources with access to these negotiations. First, Russia fundamentally doesn't trust American or Western security guarantees to Ukraine under any circumstances. They've stated this explicitly in multiple forums. From Moscow's perspective, any deal that leaves Ukraine with substantial Western military support, extensive Western weapons systems, ongoing training relationships with NATO countries, and economic integration with the West, even if it's not formal NATO membership, still creates what they consider an unacceptable Western military presence on their border. They view it as NATO membership in everything but name. They're demanding that security guarantees be minimal, that Western military aid end completely, that Ukraine be genuinely neutral, meaning no significant military relationship with the West at all. The Trump framework doesn't provide that level of separation, so Russia rejects it as insufficient. Second, Russia is demanding Ukrainian demilitarization as a formal, enforceable, permanent condition of any peace agreement. Not just no NATO membership, not just limits on certain weapons systems, comprehensive restrictions on the size, structure, and capabilities of Ukrainian military forces. According to reports from early 2022 negotiations and recent discussions, Russian demands have included capping Ukrainian active military personnel at numbers well below what would be needed for credible territorial defense, something like 85,000 troops for a country of 40 million people and 600,000 square kilometers. Severe restrictions on heavy weaponry, including prohibitions on main battle tanks above certain numbers, restrictions on artillery systems and their ranges, elimination of tactical ballistic missiles, and limits on combat aircraft. Prohibition on air defense systems that could threaten Russian aircraft operating near Ukrainian borders. International monitoring and verification mechanisms that would give Russia insight into and potentially veto over Ukrainian military development. The current Trump proposals include some demilitarization elements, but nothing approaching the comprehensive neutering of Ukrainian military capability that Russia is demanding. So Russia views the proposals as leaving Ukraine too capable of future military resistance or of serving as a platform for Western power projection. Third, Russia is demanding territorial recognition not just of Crimea, which is included in Trump's framework, but of the 4 entire oblasts they claimed to annex in September 2022, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson. Full annexation with recognition of Russian sovereignty, not autonomy arrangements or demilitarized zones or future referendums. And here's the critical detail that makes this especially difficult. Russia is demanding recognition of these oblasts in their entirety, their full administrative borders, including significant portions that Russia doesn't currently physically control militarily. For example, Russia controls maybe 60 to 70% of Zaporizhzhia Oblast, including the regional capital, but they're demanding Ukraine recognize Russian sovereignty over 100% of it. Same with Kherson Oblast. They're essentially demanding Ukraine cede territory that Ukrainian forces currently hold and defend. The Trump framework proposes various arrangements for contested territories, but stops short of full recognition of Russian sovereignty over areas Russia doesn't occupy. Moscow views this as unacceptable. Fourth, and this is perhaps most revealing about Russian objectives, Moscow is demanding political changes within Ukraine itself as a condition for peace. They refuse to negotiate seriously with the Zelensky government, which they characterize as illegitimate since Ukraine postponed elections that are constitutionally prohibited during martial law, but which Russia uses as pretext for non-recognition. Russian officials have stated in various forms that any sustainable peace requires political restructuring in Kyiv. What does that mean specifically? It means removing from power political figures and parties that Russia considers irredeemably anti-Russian and nationalist. It means ensuring that pro-Russian political forces have guaranteed influence in Ukrainian governance, possibly through constitutional arrangements that give certain regions veto powers. It means fundamentally reorienting Ukrainian foreign policy away from Western integration and toward accommodation of Russian interests. This is regime change by another name, and it's absolutely non-negotiable from Russia's perspective. The Trump framework doesn't include any of this. It can't, because dictating Ukrainian domestic politics would be obvious violation of sovereignty. So Russia sees the framework as failing to address what they consider root causes of the conflict. When American negotiators, first in failed Alaska summit in August, then in the aborted Budapest meeting in October, and most recently in the Moscow talks in early December, have tried to find middle ground on these issues, have attempted to craft compromise language that addresses Russian concerns while remaining politically viable for Ukraine and the West, Russian officials have been remarkably blunt in their responses. Multiple sources report variations of the same message. Why should we compromise when time is on our side? Why should we accept half measures now when continuing the war will likely give us everything we want in another year? Why should we trust American promises when we can achieve our objectives through military victory? That's the real answer underneath all the diplomatic language. Russia believes fundamentally that they're winning the war that actually matters, the war of attrition, the war of industrial production, the war of political will and staying power. They believe Western support for Ukraine is politically unsustainable over the long term. They believe Ukrainian military capability is being irreversibly degraded. They believe their own economic and military staying power exceeds what the West is willing to commit. So from their strategic perspective, accepting Trump's peace deal, even though it's extraordinarily favorable, would mean settling for less than they can achieve through continued fighting. Now, let me explain in detail why Trump's negotiating approach, despite being dramatically and fundamentally different from Biden's approach in tactics and tone, still isn't producing the leverage necessary to change Russian calculations. This is critical to understanding the limits of American power in the current international environment. First, Trump's primary leverage, theoretically, is his ability and willingness to cut off or drastically reduce American military aid to Ukraine, thereby forcing Kyiv to accept terms they currently reject. He's made this threat explicitly both publicly and privately. The logic is straightforward. If Ukraine knows American support will end unless they agree to Trump's framework, they'll have to accept it regardless of how painful the terms are, and that leverage has actually worked to some degree. Ukraine has indicated willingness to consider territorial compromises and NATO concessions that would have been completely unthinkable under the Zelensky government 2 years ago. Ukrainian officials reading the political situation in Washington understand that Trump means what he says about potentially withdrawing support, so they've bent significantly on positions they once called red lines. But here's the fundamental problem that undermines this entire approach. That leverage over Ukraine is utterly meaningless if Russia doesn't want the deal, even with Ukraine's forced acceptance. Trump can threaten and cajole and pressure Zelensky all he wants, can force Ukraine to agree to almost anything, but if Moscow isn't interested in the agreement, regardless of what Ukraine accepts, then all that pressure accomplishes nothing except demonstrating American inability to deliver outcomes. Second, Trump's other major leverage is supposed to be his relationship with Putin. His ability to talk to Putin in ways Biden never could, his reputation as a deal maker who understands how to structure agreements that give both sides face-saving wins. The problem is that personal relationships and negotiating skills, while sometimes useful at the margins, don't overcome fundamental strategic calculations rooted in national interest assessments. Putin isn't refusing Trump's deal because he dislikes Trump personally or because the terms aren't structured cleverly enough. He's refusing because Russia has assessed that their national interests are better served by continuing the war than by accepting the deal. No amount of personal chemistry or creative deal structure changes that underlying calculation. And actually, there's reason to believe that having Trump in office pursuing this peace deal might perversely reduce Russian incentive to settle. Why? Because from Moscow's perspective, Trump's presidency is already delivering significant benefits to Russian strategic interests, even without a Ukraine deal. Trump has expressed skepticism about NATO, has questioned American commitment to European defense, has created tensions within the Western alliance, has signaled potential reduction in support for Ukraine. All of these dynamics benefit Russia by fragmenting Western unity and reducing long-term threats to Russian interests. So Russia gets some of what it wants from Trump's presidency automatically, which reduces their incentive to pay for peace by making concessions. Third, Trump's implied leverage through sanctions relief is less powerful than American policymakers tend to assume because Russia has already absorbed the worst impacts of sanctions and adapted their economy to function under these constraints. When comprehensive Western sanctions were first imposed in 2022, there was genuine economic crisis in Russia. The ruble crashed, inflation spiked, access to critical technologies was cut off. But that was 3 years ago. Russia has had time to adjust. They've redirected energy exports from Europe to China, India, and other markets willing to buy at discounted prices. They've developed alternative payment systems and transaction mechanisms that bypass Western financial infrastructure. They've substituted domestic production for imports in many sectors, accepting lower quality in exchange for independence. They've received significant support from China, both economic and technological, that helps offset Western restrictions. Russia's economy is under strain, certainly, but it hasn't collapsed and isn't on the verge of collapsing. Russian leadership has demonstrated they can sustain the current level of economic pressure while continuing military operations. So while sanctions relief would be nice for Russia's economy, would improve living standards, would provide access to better technology, it's not essential to regime survival or war prosecution. Russia doesn't need sanctions relief badly enough to compromise core security objectives to get it. Fourth, and this often gets overlooked in analysis of the negotiations, Trump's leverage is constrained by his own domestic political situation in ways that Russia clearly understands and exploits. Trump campaigned partially on being able to end the Ukraine war quickly. He promised his supporters he'd stop the endless spending, stop the proxy war, bring peace. But if diplomacy fails completely and the war continues, Trump faces difficult political choices. Does he follow through on threats to cut Ukraine aid, which would make him appear to be abandoning Ukraine to Russian conquest and would draw fierce criticism even from some Republicans? Or does he continue aid despite his promises, which makes him look weak and ineffective, like he couldn't deliver on his signature foreign policy promise? Either choice damages him politically. Congressional Republicans are divided between isolationists who want complete withdrawal from Ukraine and hawks who believe America must stand up to Russian aggression. Democrats will attack Trump regardless, either for abandoning allies or for failing to achieve peace despite making grand promises. Russia understands this political bind. They know that American domestic politics creates time pressure on Trump to produce some kind of agreement or face admission of failure. So they're comfortable simply waiting, refusing offers, maintaining military pressure, confident that eventually American politics will force Trump either to accept less favorable terms from Russia's perspective or to withdraw support from Ukraine unilaterally, either outcome being acceptable to Moscow. Let me walk through the specific failed negotiation attempts in chronological detail because the pattern reveals a lot about the dynamics at play. In August 2025, after months of preliminary discussions, Trump organized a summit in Anchorage, Alaska. The location was chosen as neutral ground, not Russia, not America proper, not Europe. Security was extraordinary. The agenda was ambitious, nothing less than a framework agreement to end the war. American delegation included Witkoff as special envoy, various State Department and National Security Council officials. Russian delegation included senior Kremlin advisors and foreign ministry representatives. The summit lasted 2 days. By all accounts, discussions were professional and substantive, but they ended without agreement, without even a joint communique, without scheduled follow-up meetings. Both sides blamed the other for inflexibility. American officials said Russia made unrealistic demands regarding Ukrainian demilitarization and territorial concessions. Russian officials said American proposals didn't address fundamental Russian security concerns and amounted to trying to impose terms rather than negotiate equitably. In October, Trump tried a different approach, announced a planned summit in Budapest, Hungary. This was supposed to be a three-way meeting, Trump, Putin, and Zelensky, all in the same room to hash out remaining differences directly at the presidential level. This was a big deal, hugely ambitious, the kind of dramatic personal diplomacy that Trump favors. The announcement itself was meant to create momentum, to lock all parties into the process. But within days of announcement, the summit collapsed. Russia indicated Putin wouldn't attend. Official explanations were vague: scheduling issues, insufficient preparation, need for more groundwork at lower levels. The real reason, according to diplomatic sources, was that Russia assessed that Ukraine and the West had not moved sufficiently on core Russian demands to make presidential-level meeting worthwhile. Putin wasn't going to sit in a room with Zelensky and Trump just to have his fundamental positions rejected. Better to wait until conditions improved from Russia's perspective. After the Budapest failure, Trump administration changed tactics again. Instead of trying to bring leaders together, they focused on developing a detailed written peace proposal that could be presented as a take-it-or-leave-it offer. This became the famous 28-point plan that leaked to media in November. The plan was extraordinarily detailed, covering everything from ceasefire lines to verification mechanisms to sanctions phase-out timelines to security architecture. Here's where things get particularly interesting and revealing about the negotiating dynamics. The initial version of this 28-point plan was reportedly drafted with significant input from Russian sources. Kirill Dmitriev, a Kremlin advisor and head of Russia's sovereign wealth fund, apparently had extensive involvement in shaping the document. This was supposed to be a clever negotiating tactic. By involving Russia in drafting the proposal, Trump's team thought they could create Russian buy-in and ownership. Russia would be more likely to accept terms they helped write, but this backfired spectacularly. When the initial 28-point plan was presented to Ukraine and European allies, they rejected it as absurdly pro-Russian, basically a Russian wish list dressed up as an American peace proposal. Ukraine pointed out that the plan included virtually everything Russia wanted regarding demilitarization, territorial concessions, and political constraints, while providing Ukraine almost nothing except an end to active combat. European allies were furious that they weren't consulted despite being expected to provide security guarantees and reconstruction funding. So the plan went back for revisions. In late November, meetings in Geneva between American and Ukrainian delegations produced significant changes to make the proposal more balanced and acceptable to Kyiv. These revisions included stronger security guarantees for Ukraine, more limited demilitarization requirements, more flexible arrangements for contested territories, and timeline for sanctions relief tied more explicitly to Russian compliance with all terms. This revised proposal was then taken to Miami for further consultations with European representatives to ensure broader Western support. The idea was to present Putin with a united front, America, Ukraine, and Europe all backing the same framework, making clear that this was the best Russia would get and that rejection meant continued unified Western support for Ukraine. On December 2nd, Witkoff and Kushner flew to Moscow to present this revised framework to Putin personally. The meeting lasted 5 hours, taking place in the Kremlin. Putin apparently listened, asked detailed questions, pushed back on multiple points. When it ended, his advisor, Yuri Ushakov, delivered the official readout. No compromise version of a peace settlement has been found. The gaps between positions remain substantial. More work is needed. In diplomatic language, that's a polite rejection. But the real Russian position was clarified in subsequent statements. By revising the plan to make it more acceptable to Ukraine and Europe, by moving away from the initial Russian influence version, America had effectively made the proposal less attractive to Russia. From Moscow's perspective, we helped write the first version, which was reasonable from our standpoint. Then you changed it to favor Ukraine, and now you expect us to accept terms that are worse for us than what was originally proposed? Why would we do that? This reveals a fundamental problem with the American negotiating approach. Trump's team gave Russia input into initial drafting, which created Russian expectations that their positions would be respected. Then, when those positions proved unacceptable to Ukraine and Europe, the proposal was revised to be more balanced. But Russia viewed this as backtracking and betrayal of the understanding they thought they had. If you give one side influence over drafting and then change what they drafted, you've essentially given them two chances to reject. First, the revised version for being different from what they wanted, and second, the original version if they're asked to return to it. This is a tactical negotiating error that experienced diplomats avoid. After the December Moscow rejection, Trump administration tried to maintain momentum by immediately convening another round of talks in Miami between American and Ukrainian delegations. These talks, held December 5th through 6th, were described as substantive. Zelensky participated remotely. Witkoff and other American officials tried to address Ukrainian concerns while also considering Russian objections to the Geneva revisions. The joint statement after Miami talks acknowledged what everyone already knew. Genuine progress towards any agreement depends entirely on Russia demonstrating sincere commitment to sustainable long-term peace, including meaningful steps toward de-escalation. In other words, the ball is completely in Russia's court, and Russia isn't playing. Trump administration has pushed Ukraine to maximum flexibility. They've invested enormous time and political capital. They've tried multiple formats, bilateral summits, trilateral meetings, detailed written proposals, shuttle diplomacy, and none of it has moved Russia off their maximal positions. Now let me zoom out and talk about what this pattern of failed negotiations reveals about the current state of American power and influence in the international system, because the implications go far beyond Ukraine. The United States is supposed to be the world's sole superpower. We're supposed to have unmatched leverage through our military, the world's largest and most capable by far, through our economy, still the largest and most central to global commerce, through our alliance system, NATO, and partners across the globe, through our financial power, dollar dominance, and control of key institutions, through our technological advantages, through our cultural influence. With all of that power, we should theoretically be able to broker settlements in conflicts where we're providing massive support to one side and imposing massive costs on the other. And yet, we can't end the Ukraine war despite providing Ukraine with tens of billions in military aid, despite imposing comprehensive sanctions on Russia, despite leading international coalitions supporting Ukraine diplomatically. Why? Because power and leverage are always situational and contextual. They depend fundamentally on the other side caring enough about what you can offer or threaten to change their behavior in ways you want. Russia doesn't care enough about sanctions relief to compromise security interests they consider existential. They've demonstrated they can sustain their economy under current sanctions indefinitely. Russia doesn't care enough about Trump's personal relationship with Putin or American diplomatic approval to accept terms they view as strategically inadequate. Personal relationships are nice, but they don't override national interest calculations. Russia doesn't care about international isolation because they've found alternative partnerships, particularly with China, that provide enough economic and diplomatic support to function. Most critically, Russia doesn't care about our threats to continue supporting Ukraine because they believe, based on their assessment of Western political dynamics and Ukrainian military attrition, that time is on their side. They think they can achieve their objectives through continued military operations, so why accept a negotiated compromise that gives them less? Our leverage fails because Russia doesn't value what we're offering enough to pay our price and doesn't fear what we're threatening enough to change course. This is a fundamental problem for American foreign policy more broadly. If we can't force outcomes in Ukraine where we have enormous leverage and deep commitment, how are we going to shape events in other conflicts where we have less? Taiwan and China, North Korea, Iran, South China Sea disputes. We're going to face the same dynamic. Adversaries who don't value American carrots enough to comply, who don't fear American sticks enough to back down, and who calculate they can achieve their goals despite American opposition. The Trump administration's comprehensive failure to broker Ukrainian peace, despite pushing harder than Biden ever did and offering terms far more favorable to Russia, exposes the limits of American leverage in a multipolar world where other great powers have options and alternatives. Let me lay out what I see happening over the next several months based on current trajectories and the clear failure of diplomatic efforts. First, Trump will continue trying publicly to broker peace because he's politically committed to being the president who ended this war and can't easily pivot away from that promise. But privately, his administration begins preparing for the alternative: long-term reduced American support for Ukraine and gradual acceptance of Russian territorial gains as facts on the ground that can't be changed. This creates policy incoherence where public rhetoric about supporting Ukraine as long as necessary contradicts private planning for gradual disengagement. Second, Ukraine, increasingly aware that their main supporter is losing patience and commitment, faces an impossible strategic situation. They can't win militarily without sustained Western support, but they also can't achieve acceptable peace because Russia won't negotiate seriously. They're trapped between continuing to fight an unwinnable war of attrition or accepting a peace that amounts to surrender on every significant point. This creates enormous political pressure within Ukraine. Zelensky's position becomes increasingly untenable. You're already seeing Ukrainian domestic opposition criticizing him both for fighting too long and for being willing to compromise at all. Third, Russia, observing Western diplomatic failure and sensing opportunity, intensifies military operations to grab maximum territory before any eventual ceasefire. You've seen this already in recent weeks: massive drone attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, renewed ground offensives in multiple sectors of the front. Russia is racing to create facts on the ground while Western resolve crumbles and before Trump potentially reduces aid. The war actually gets worse in the short term as Russia pushes hard while they have advantage. Fourth, sometime probably in mid-2026, there's some kind of crisis that forces resolution. Either Ukrainian military position collapses entirely, making continued resistance impossible, or Western support collapses politically with the United States drastically cutting aid and forcing Ukraine to negotiate from a position of extreme weakness, or there's an escalatory incident, perhaps involving NATO territory or nuclear threats, that creates new urgency for settlement. Regardless of specific trigger, the endgame involves Ukraine accepting terms far worse than anything currently proposed: massive territorial losses, severe demilitarization, and effective neutering as independent geopolitical actor. Fifth, the eventual settlement, however it's achieved, will be widely seen as Russian victory and American strategic failure. Russia will have achieved most of its core objectives. NATO expansion will be permanently blocked in Ukraine. Russia will control significant Ukrainian territory. Ukrainian military will be restricted. Western influence in the former Soviet space will be demonstrated as limited, and American credibility will be damaged. Allies around the world will note that despite massive American support, Ukraine still lost. Despite comprehensive sanctions, Russia still won. Despite grand diplomacy,